holding the production of bills, currency, but inflation was at an unsustainable level for a fixed exchange regime. And after 73, there was the flooding and rates in developed countries of 11, 17%, 18%. So this is a monetary scandal in a sense. And by 79, in which they established the European monetary system, and in 1980, when Volcker became the president of the Fed, actually it was ever since 1984 where we can see the adoption of an effect of more orthodox policies, quantitative targets for monetary expansion by decreasing consumer prices. And after 1990, there's the adoption of policies as a means of inflation targets by decreasing inflation in these countries to 0.3, minus 3, 1, 0.5, things that became acceptable as low inflation, that recovered the credibility for monetary policies the way it was followed by all central banks. Another chart I'd like to show you is this, which is the average price of gold over 1974 to 1984. In dollars, while there was still a link to gold, there was a fixed parity of 35 that central banks theoretically could exchange dollars for gold. And then here people started questioning that promise. Then the promise was broken with. People try to keep inflation based on limitation of monetary aggregates. They were not successful. And over here, the adoption of inflation target policies began. What we have to understand are the actual conditions of the production framework and economic structures that enabled relative change in the quality of fiscal policies that began demanding lower monetary expansion. Why did inflation continue going up in Europe and in the US while they were adopting quantitative restriction on the monetary base? There are actual factors in the economy, such as the stock exchange crisis in '87, the fall of the Berlin Wall in '88, that required a lot of expense and spending by the German government, and the first Gulf War that led to, even though central banks try to control inflation based on the monetary base, they were not able to. But all of this was counterbalanced by real factors of increase of productivity globally, and also produced by the integration of China and those behind, those from underdeveloped economies, developing economies, and a whole set of dynamic rules that began establishing themselves, and the creation of the Eurozone unquestionably created a lot of economies of scale by releasing a lot of productive energies in Europe, for example, and a lot of technological changes in terms of IT. That was a revolution all over the world over this period. And with increase of fiscal revenues, governments didn't need to be so eager in terms of controlling their inflation, because inflation started going down naturally. That was the time when inflation target policies were adopted at the same time, which led to the results that we all know. In the U.S., at the present time, inflation target policies have been formally adopted. However, in Greenspan's memoir book of memories, he says that the Fed does not have a legal mandate to contain a bubble in the stock exchange market, and that it was legally established that price stability is Fed's fundamental concern in order to promote long-term economic growth. That's what they call double mandate. They don't have a price mandate only. They have mandate to control prices and to decrease unemployment, which they do through increasing economic activity. So the Fed is always keeping an eye on inflation and trying to increase economic activity as long as inflation doesn't go up, based on that informal target that they determined to guide their actions, but with which they do not undertake a public formal commitment.
O que falta a gente avaliar então é até que ponto essa recente crise.
So to what extent this recent economic crisis has proven that inflation target policies is the best strategy to guide monetary policies, or is it just some new disguise for the mistake of credit boom that actually led to the crisis? And to answer this question, I'd like to invite you all to talk a little bit about monetary policies early in the 20s. Generally speaking, people believe that the years between the First World War and Depression were years in which monetary excesses of the First World War had been suspended, had been put a hold on, and that the recovery of conversion of gold conversion was a sign of monetary stability, and that there was a speculation with assets in the 20s caused by lack of regulation in the stock exchange market that actually led that crisis. That was the general belief. But the data that we have available tell a different story, because from 21 to 29, the supply of currency in the U.S. at $28 billion at the time, that represented an increase of 61.8% over 8 years. And many mechanisms were used to expand the supply of currency, because there was still formally the gold exchange standard. So circulating currency was pretty much constant, around $3.7 billion. And the monetary expansion that took place happened through credit instruments. And this should not surprise us, right? Because In the late 19th century, in England, they had realized that if you have a gold standard monetary system with your central bank, then the shrinking mechanism, the automatic shrinking mechanism for currency does not happen over a short-term period. Not externally, which is in effect that Hume described for gold exports, nor internally from one bank cashing bills from other banks by making competitive compensation and drafting. What happens is there is a central bank that provides liquidity to financial agents. So this mechanism will eventually work, because it will enable certain control, and it will thus limit the powers of agents in order to expand the supply of currency. But it doesn't completely prevent this from happening.
Aqui são esses dados que eu acabei de passar para vocês.
This is the data that I just gave you.
No Professor
Rothbard,
no America's Great Depression,
in America's Great Depression,
ele apresenta esse quadrinho.
He demonstrates this data, where he uses the concept called total dollar claims.
Então ele mostra o tamanho das
He shows the size of the
reservas
reserves of gold.
E como aumentou nesse período de 21 a 29
and how there was an increase during this period from 21 to 29,
dessa reserva de ouro,
the rights to withdraw from these gold reserves,
então não coberto,
and the increase that was not covered
desses claims, desses créditos,
from these credit claims
em dólar que teoricamente seriam cobertos em ouro.
That should be theoretically matched with gold deposits.
Corresponder a ouro que não estão
There's some other aspects that should correspond to the gold that should be here. There's not enough space that would explain this difference.
Mais essenciais para entender o argumento do
Here I brought the main elements to understand Rothbard's argument.
Ele quis dizer o seguinte: isso daqui não mostra o tamanho da
doesn't show us the size of the monetary expansion.
Isso daqui mostra o tamanho da
This shows the size of the monetary expansion.
E o tamanho da expansão inflacionária.
And the size of that expansion that was inflationary is here.
Então, nessa época,
during this period of time,
nos anos 20 se criou as condições para aquilo que aconteceu.
What happened was the conditions were created for what happened later.
E o professor Rothbard,
there are some people, and Rothbard quotes Irving Fisher,
como uma das pessoas que acreditava
is one of the people who believed that as the price level, as long as the price level was not increasing during the 20s,
ninguém tinha que se preocupar com inflação.
No one had to worry about inflation.
E não teria crash no caminho.
There would be no crash along the way.
Porque não estava acontecendo inflação.
Because inflation was not occurring.
Como medida pelo
inflation that is measured as an increase in the level of prices.
Mas a lição importante que eu acho que a gente pode tirar,
the important lesson that we can get here, we can learn here,
quando tu tem uma política monetária,
is that when you have a monetary policy
para expansão de moeda, são aqueles limites
that has real limits imposed by the central banks, seeking solely
manter o nível de preços,
to maintain the price level in a stable level.
Esse tipo de política não
this type of policy
impede ciclos de negócios
doesn't keep
pela
business cycles from happening from the inflationary expansion of credit.